Well, good morning. Welcome to this session, this new AAR session on Holiness and Pentecostal movements, intertwined pasts, presents, and futures. This session is jointly sponsored by the Manchester Wesley Research Center. I'm Geordan Hammond. I direct the Wesley Research Center and teach church history and Wesley studies at Nazarene Theological College in the UK. And sponsored as well by Pentecostal Theological Seminary, which is the only Wesleyan Pentecostal seminary in North America, with its foundational Christian heritage tracing back to the 19th century Wesleyan holiness movement. The Manchester Wesley Research Center is a partnership of institutions and a community of scholars working together to promote research in the Methodist, Wesleyan, and evangelical traditions, and thinking about evangelical traditions broadly, including the Holiness and Pentecostal movements. PTS is one of the partners of the Manchester Wesley Research Center, and the Wesley Center is a related scholarly organization of AAR, and so we're grateful for the opportunity that that's given us to plan and host this session with PTS. The session had its genesis in conversations between David Hahn, David Bundy, and myself at a joint meeting of the Society for Pentecostal Studies and the Wesleyan Theological Society on the campus of PTS in March of this year. And it's also a result of ongoing relationships that have developed through the partnership between the Wesley Center and PTS. So it's the first of what we hope may be an ongoing series of sessions at AAR that look at intersections between the Holiness and Pentecostal traditions. Historians, theologians who study these traditions are aware of common historical roots in the 19th and 20th centuries. Some would include the 18th century Methodist Wesleyan revival within that, and intersections between the Christian communities that they established and the theology that they espoused, as well as tensions and in some cases hostility between them. I don't have scientific evidence, but in my experience, these historical and theological connections are regrettably, in my view, largely unknown in these traditions by ministers and lay people, particularly lay people today, and even students at theological colleges within these traditions. Now, my observance of this is primarily in a theological college context in the Wesleyan Holiness Nazarene tradition. And I don't have particular data on it, but it's probably the case that the majority or thereabout of our students, roughly 300 students, are from a variety of Pentecostal and charismatic churches. That would be especially true of our undergraduate students. One only needs to participate in one of our chapel services at Nazarene Theological College to observe the prevalence of charismatic and Pentecostal influences on worship style. I think these students often have from these backgrounds, often have a vague idea of connections in the wider evangelical tradition, but there's far less awareness of the historical intersections between, say, the Church of the Nazarene and these Pentecostal and charismatic traditions. David Hahn, from his context, noted that this unseemly disconnect or lack of awareness of shared historical and theological roots among Wesleyan Holiness and Pentecostal traditions is likewise discernible amongst Pentecostals, for example, in the Church of God, Cleveland, whose historical traces and historical trajectories are deeply woven with Wesleyan grammars of spirituality and theology. So part of the justification for this session is our shared desire and ongoing efforts to raise awareness of such commonalities that have either been lost or forgotten in the Wesleyan tradition and its related movements. So with that in mind, we hope to be able to speak in some ways to both an academic and popular audience through this session and hopefully future ones.
So to get us started on this shared project, we have 3 papers that will explore some preliminary mapping of intertwined past, presence, and also perhaps the futures of the Holiness and Pentecostal movements, both in historical and theological perspectives. So we'll have some time for questions and discussion after each paper, and we'll have a short break after the second paper and a response to all these 3 papers that will be presented today. Geordan and I will be sharing the chairing of this session, so I'll be chairing the first half of the session with the presentation of the first 2 papers, and then we'll have a small break, followed by our third paper from Chris Green, and then a response to all 3 papers. So to introduce our presenters and the papers they will be presenting, first, David Bundy will be presenting a paper. David Bundy is the Associate Director at Manchester Wesley Research Center and also Research Professor of World Christian Studies at New York Theological Seminary. And his paper is titled, "The Preachers and Their Students, God's Bible School as a Seedbed of Radical Holiness and Pentecostal Leaders, 1891 to 1910. And this presentation will be followed by Luther O'Connor's paper. And Luther is the Associate Professor of United Methodist Studies and Director of the Center for Evangelical United Brethren Heritage at United Theological Seminary. And his paper is titled, "A World Tour of Evangelism, Henley Clay, Morrison, and Overseas Networks of Radical Holiness Movement, 1909 to 1910. So we will begin with our first presenter, David Bundy, if you'd come forward. And would you welcome David?
God's Bible School. The site is on the edge of a hill overlooking downtown Cincinnati. Neat, small, functional brick buildings are close together. It was once arguably the center of a religious reformation, and now it seems less than revolutionary, indeed conservative. It is not pretentious as educational institutions go. It never has been. Initially, it was the fulfillment of the dream of one man, Myron Wells Knapp, who died just as it was becoming a significant and important institution. In protest against the practice of donors giving money to have their names on the facade of buildings and institutions, he named it God's Bible School and willed it to God. After he died, his papers indicated that he was merely the chief steward. It could not be owned by the family, and it took decades for the courts in the state of Ohio to decide that God could not own property in Ohio. Not only was the ownership ambiguous, also the date of its establishment. As in many ministries, there were chapel classes, mostly taught by Knapp, but also by visiting evangelists and occasionally staff, especially the women, from at least 1897, but maybe 2 or 3 years before that. The school only officially opened in its new building on the hill in 1900. Faculty and teaching staff is also a problematic category. The distinction between visiting preachers, revivalist staff, students, and teaching faculty was often unclear. For example, Beatrice M. Finney, a Southern Methodist from Kentucky, was on the original faculty of 1900, but she was also on the first list of the original students. She later became a regular contributor of articles on spirituality to God's Revivalist. That was the magazine of the institution. And finally a missionary to South Africa. It is probable that she was both student and faculty at the same time, part of the institution's testimony of equality. Because of its lack of pretension, and perhaps because of the quirkiness of its luminaries, it has been generally ignored by historians of American religion. Moody and Northfield are continuously mentioned in scholarly literature, but I would want to argue that in this essay, in the Modest Halls and Chapel, a revolution was fomented in 1891 to 1910 that continues to shape world Christianities. This institution provided a generation of leaders of both Pentecostal movements and radical holiness movements. But when they attended this school, they were not yet divided into separate religious traditions. They were merely radical holiness Pentecost students. The faculty also came from a wide variety of backgrounds, and we will look at that a bit later. But first, three modest disclaimers have to be made. First, I'm making no claim to firstness for either God's Bible School or for NAP with regard to almost anything. They were part of a global diffuse network in which ideas and relationships ebbed and flowed easily, and were often contentious and subject to political as well as theological analysis. The second disclaimer is that GBS, God's Bible School, or NAP's node in that global network was not the only node in which future Pentecostal and radical holiness leaders were formed, nor was it perhaps the most important node within the worldwide radical holiness or Pentecostal networks. The third disclaimer is that the radical holiness movements, I'm referring to continuously in the plural, to signify their diversity in their unity. There was no magisterium in the tradition, and God's Bible School did not pretend to provide one. But an institution that arguably trained and otherwise influenced much of the first generation of the post-1906 Pentecostal leadership, and many of that same generation's radical holiness leaders, deserves some attention. The historiography on the American holiness movements tends to lump groups together in two different ways, both of which I find unsatisfying. The first is to insist that they be looked at through the prism of Methodism as a version of Methodist theology. I've just had a big fight on email with a couple of colleagues about a possible book in which one of my friends is insisting that it has to be the Methodist. The second category into which these people are lumped is to categorize everything as evangelical, as if that explains the characters of the drama. There's also a tendency to look at the denominational backgrounds of these people and consider that to be the primary hermeneutical key. Thus, Quakers are always Quakers, Baptists and Presbyterians are always Reformed, and Methodists are viewed as a group. But the reality was ever so much more complex. Their primary identity was often not their religious community of origin, but their participation in these radical holiness movements. The radical holiness movements I'm defining as those groups outside of or on the margins of Methodism, which accepted a version of sanctification, holiness, baptism of the Holy Spirit, Christian perfection, with parallels to that of the Methodists. These people, the persons who thus identified were not already Methodists, who were not already Methodists, did not become Methodist or demonstrate interest in the larger Methodist identity, but remained loosely within their denominations or became independent. Their primary ecclesial and theological identity was to that of the radical holiness movements. They would use their previous relationships as bridges to people and to congregations, but they rarely participated in the power structures of their organizations. Their understandings of baptism of the Holy Spirit were that it constituted the basis for transcending the limitations and boundaries of the theologies based in debates from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Importantly, they were open to innovation in theology, governance, and practice, and innovate they certainly did. Sociologically, they were normally not in conformity to the norms of their received traditions, and were often marginalized or expelled. Ecclesiologically, they relativized the power structures and the value of their denominations and rarely participated in those structures above a local level. To maintain their livelihoods and ministries, they were forced to find new networks that in some instances came to function as new movements and later as denominations. Once again, there was no uniformity. People were allowed to change their opinions, their relationships, and so forth. The self-perception of these radical holiness movements was that they were creating community on the model of that of the Pentecost events described in the biblical Acts of the Apostles. The Pentecost narratives were the essential and exclusive model for Christian experience, community, and mission. The church was to be a community, each person baptized in the Holy Spirit, and the ensemble of that community was to be led by the Holy Spirit as each individual was also led. The community was to be characterized by perfect love, unity, equality, and living by faith as they ministered within the community of shared faith and worked among the poor and participated in mission together. It was anticipated that this Pentecost community would unite all persons baptized with the Holy Ghost and with fire. Faith healing and premillennialism were crucial, contested and diversely understood parts of the Pentecost paradigm. Shaped by the international quartet of Cullis, Boardman, Stokemeyer, and Andrew Murray, the doctrine became central to the radical holiness movements. Both conversion, sanctification, and baptism of the Holy Spirit were to be instantaneous, expedited by faith, and the debate was whether or not that could also be true for healing. Mission, both domestic and foreign, was central to the identity of these movements. It was at the level of nearly being a doctrinal issue. Their model that they chose or inherited was that of William Taylor, who is interesting because he perhaps more than anybody else relativized 19th century North American and British religious culture as well as cultures in general. And when one reads through the missionary narratives of the people who went out with Taylor, it is quite striking how different they are from most all of the other groups. This understanding of Taylor's, his idea of self-supporting mission so that the person on the ground is free to do what they need to do, merged seamlessly with Georg Mueller's faith mission concept. There was also an important social component to this Pentecost vision, beyond the already radical egalitarian vision of spirit baptism. Individuals were not to be valued based on gender, class, race, wealth, and education. It was a vision of a new humanity without borders. They were very supportive of women and of early labor movements. There's a lot of connections between the holiness movement, radical holiness movements, and the women's movements here and around the world, but also the labor movements, especially the more radical ones like the WWL or the Wobblies. Experiments in Pentecost communism were undertaken, and Oswald Chambers, who was teaching at God's Bible School at the time, said of the place, "This is truly holiness socialism." This paradigm of this complex of issues gave it a certain amount of intellectual coherence and practical coherence and network coherence. I'd like to make a few comments about Knapp, primarily to indicate why I think people actually listen to him. His, somewhat you might call pie-in-the-sky vision for Christianity, which rarely ever worked all that efficiently on the ground. but to look at four different categories of themes within him, just very, very briefly. The first one, urbanization, industrialization, and modernization. Standard in the literature about these groups ever since the 1930s is that they are essentially anti-modern or merely a version of modernity. Knapp, I would want to argue, actually embraced modernity, embraced industrialization, embraced the urban environment, at the same time worked to try to improve the situation as he lamented its brutality, exploitation of the poor, and exploitation of immigrants in the cities. He celebrated the modernity while contesting them, by contesting aspects of it that made the powerful more powerful and enabled purveyors, especially of addictive materials, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, sex, to more easily reach and expand their markets. He did not attack the systems that made the low-cost distribution possible, but the misuse of that. The second point, democratization, the issue of power. The issue of power was central to Knapp's thinking and to the thinking of the radical holiness movements. Power was positive when it came from God, negative when it had its source in the human exploiters of the state, political party, industry, secret societies, church, and the Methodist-related holiness movement. These, he was equal opportunity. These institutions conspire together and separately to limit the power of God for their own purposes. The churches are more evil because they are not what they say they are, excluding from power those who promote transforming power of God, accepting support from exploiters in change for ignoring the effects of their exploitation, and not working to transform people and their context as the Bible demands. Knapp argued that the divine power was for all believers, and that the power of God can decrease dependency on those who exploit and use their power against the common people. He found that most aspects of human culture needed to be renewed, just as all individuals needed to be renewed. As I mentioned, he considered the church to be no better, maybe even worse than the rest of the world, because the values he felt that the churches had were those of exclusion and power, and no freedom to adapt their people's lives to the biblical Pentecost model. The Methodist-dominated National Holiness Association was found by Knapp to have adopted non-democratic values, to those similar to the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Freemasons. That is, they excluded from the holiness movement those who did not agree with them or came from different religious traditions. Knapp, from the beginning of his institution, involved people who were Congregationalists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists North and South, anybody he could find, he would include them, including racially. The black denominations, people were welcome there. One of the few places in Cincinnati where a religious institution was multiracial. The aspirations for humanization. The last half of the 19th century was a time of expanding aspirations for humanization, the improvement of quality of life, democracy, and empowering of the working classes of the poor. There was a struggle of the progressives and international workers of the world for social justice. The Salvation Army and its many derivatives were strong. Radical holiness missions were a prominent part of the urban landscape of North America. And the social gospel was led by Rauschenbusch, who actually considered, as you know, joining the Salvation Army, and who has been noted, spoke in tongues, at least in his devotions. Horace Bushnell experienced sanctification and also wrote about healing. So this network of these ideas was included people way beyond the confines of the poor in Cincinnati. Knapp was in some ways more comprehensive in his argument, framed in a mid-American context than many other radicals. He argued that humans have rights that are given by God but taken away by negative powers. He was against war. He insisted the Christian was to care for the poor, minister to the prisoners, lift up the downtrodden, fallen women, orphans, and uneducated persons, African Americans, Appalachian poor, and to heal the sick. Healing was presented as a complicated, inclusive, liberating project. He notably did not blame those who were ill for their lack of faith or for having sin in their background, much like A.B. Simpson or William Boardman. Global vision in a period of American ascendancy. He, as would happen with Seymour later, began to advertise and support missionaries from various parts of the world, and he began to use his journal. They more or less accepted the theology and experience of the radical holiness movements, but he had no litmus test for them. He did come out, as his periodical did, firmly against the Spanish-American War. Just a few quick comments about some of the faculty, and on the back of your page I've listed some of these people. We'll start on the beginning. Most of these people, unless you work with this material, you won't have heard of, and in fact the first woman I mentioned, all I know about her is what I was told you. I've found no more. But Abby Clemens Morrow was a magazine editor, living in Boston, teaching in Cincinnati, traveling on the train back and forth. G.D. Watson, the Methodist Episcopal pastor of in Indianapolis, who left the church, became an evangelist. And you keep on going down that list, and you notice the religious affiliations and the variety within that context. Now, the students who came to study included William Seymour, A.J. Tomlinson, who is a bit of a historiographical problem about this, but some authors have argued that he couldn't have started there because it was claimed as the biography was 1895, but that is, as I've mentioned, was based on that ambiguity. Robert McAllister, founder of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. Lillian Hunt Trasher, who went from radical holiness to independent missionary. Among those who remained as part of the radical holiness Pentecost movements, as opposed to Pentecostal movements, I've listed here the most illustrious of which are probably Charles and Letty Cowman, who founded the OMS. The implications of all of this for holiness and Pentecostal and our relationships was probably best summarized in a quote I just recently found in the very last year of a publication of a British periodical by George Soltow, a British Brethren Radical Holiness observer, commenting on radical holiness ministries in early 1908. He said, "In Los Angeles, there are 20 different schools of holiness teaching, all of them split off from the churches, some of them claiming with loud voice the gift of tongues, and others with as loud a voice disclaiming and denouncing. The commonality of identity observed by Soltow and evidenced by the contributions of Martin Wells Knapp and GBS is less visible now, generally not appreciated or remembered. A careful, non-ideological analysis, I believe, of the intersections of the radical holiness Pentecostal movements and the Pentecost movements and the Pentecostal movements worldwide would reveal other nodes and radiating networks that differentiated or did not, as in the United States." Thank you.
I get a couple of minutes left over. That's pretty good. All right, it's time for discussion. So any questions?
Yes, so I love these stories about how early Holiness and early Pentecostal folks had a lot of social awareness and social concern. But it seems, I'm interested in terms of this group in Cincinnati, how widespread was that, and then how long were they able to hold on to it? Because it seems to me that these traditions are far, 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 far away from such things today.
But most of them are, I would agree. But there, in many situations, that's being reclaimed. I would give the example of the Free Methodist Church as one that is actually working to really reclaim that tradition. They never come to the Wesleyan Theological Society, but we had a meeting in Indianapolis and we had like 200 people show up, all of them with PhDs, MAs in sociology, urban transformation, name it, and they are doing it theologically and historically as Free Methodists. Now that's, just one example, but then the Salvation Army has maintained that. Not always, that's a complicated story, and depends also on which country you're talking about. France is different from Australia, from the United States, and so forth.
Yeah, Harold?
Thank you, David. I appreciate your work, and I look forward to seeing the footnotes. I've only been to God's Bible School one time. Vincent Sinott and I were there for a general conference of the Pentecostal Holiness Church. And it's Vincent's view that Knapp is the one who gave the church their name. He had the Pentecostal Holiness Library. So Vincent and I, being like we are, we wanted to see the original library. Not that it made any difference in terms of what happened.
A lot of it has been stolen over the years,
I do have a question about Thomason, but first I want to mention Trasher. A.J. Thomason gave her a Church of God license.
Right.
She used to write letters to the Church of God Evangel. She raised money, but she didn't get enough money to support what she was doing because of the unique ministry that she had, and of course, she had money for it. My thing about A.J. and God's Bible School, Homer in the early years is a decent source on a lot of this.
Yeah.
And I know he wrote about A.J. being, quote, the prevailer.
Yeah.
The problem that I have is when I met one of Homer's successors, Boyd Bull in Alabama, he showed me a stack like that of A.J. Thomas's journals that had never seen the light of day, not in the Library of Commerce or anything. I tried to persuade him to let me photocopy, do anything with it. By the time I could get anywhere near him, somebody had stolen it and now it's lost. So I have no idea to fill in the blanks that Homer may have been right or may not. But have you seen anything beyond Homer in terms of?
No, but he was clearly but he was clearly in the network. He was a very good friend, as much as somebody 20 years younger can be, of Seth Cook Reese.
Yes.
And that relationship put him in that Indiana context as part of that. And I really think, I just lost his name, Roger did the book on Tomlinson, Roger Robbins.
Oh, Robbins, yeah.
I really think he's right on that context and that those relationships. And just one quick comment: these were networks, and there was in the early years there was no exclusivity. You could write to a Church of God, you could write to a Pentecostal Holiness, you could write to a Baptist, and that was okay. There was no problem with that. It was only later in the 20s when differentiation was taking place that it became really problematic, and so most of the interdenominational journals, both here and around the world, disappeared about that time. God's Revivalist is one of the few still going, but it has become an in-house journal of a tight network.
Thank you.
David, if I can.
Yes.
Knapp's anti-power theology is really fascinating. I was wondering if you can say a bit more about the role of that in the movement, and was there within that the seeds of the decline of the movement?
Yeah, I really do think so, actually. I've been, one of the really uncomfortable facts about Christianity and other religious traditions around the world, without access to power, nobody survives. And without claiming power, nobody survives beyond the immediate thing that they're part of. And you can see that within the charismatic renewal. You have an exhibit right in front of our faces nearly of the choosing not to, for the most part, separate The ones that separated, those are the ones we still talk about. Vineyard. You know, we don't talk about, you know, there's an office of renewal in churches, but you can't find it if you go to the buildings. You know, it's, so without that power, without access to power, you don't survive. And, you know, if Constantine had not been anointed emperor in the city of York, would Christianity have ever survived for a long term? Maybe, but it would have been a very different kind of project. So, yeah.
Well, just an interesting note for your files. One maybe unexpected graduate of God's Bible College was very progressive United Methodist Bishop Emerson Colall.
Yes, 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 yeah.
I know there's a wiki page on him, but they don't admit that he was a graduate
Mo-
of God. They list all of his degrees, but not that.
Yeah. Well, most everybody will say they went to a Bible college somewhere.
Exactly.
For instance, the founder of the biographies of the and the articles on the McAllister, who founded the Pentecostal assemblies in Canada, went to a Bible school, maybe Cincinnati. You know, and nobody wants to claim that. And I kind of want to say, well, yeah, you know, there might have been some positive things about it. Now, one of the things that happened at GBS, and was mentioned here earlier, is that after Knapp dies, the thing starts to turn inward. And Knapp could publish things about the networks all across the country and around the world, and then afterward it just started going, and the anti-power thing starts to become, well, we are going to focus on whether we're being exploited, not about the larger society. And so it turns into...
All right, anyone else? Yes, please.
Well, one quick note. In terms of Free Methodists, Rick McPeak, Charter Greenville, did come to the AAR for 10 years in a row, but never went to a single session.
Yeah.
That's how they viewed it. He would come to see us, but they would not go to any sessions.
Yeah.
Just not, they're not interested.
Yeah.
But my question is back to what Jordan said. If you look at, say, the Church of the Nazarene, removing Pentecostal holiness from the title of the church, you know, and you talk about how God's Bible School turned inward, you know, is there any sense that what they lost was a trust in each other that killed these networks? Because it's obvious they were vibrant. You know, Hiram Reynolds does the same thing as Luther's talking about his paper. He goes on a Nazarene tour and attempts in 1915 to, you know, bring in other missionaries.
Yeah.
And J.B. Chapman says in an editorial in the Herald of Holiness, 1942, we were at our best when we were non-sectarian.
Yeah.
But they killed each other in some sense.
Yeah, they did, and that's what the things of differentiation, where creeds become really central and important, and the definition of who's in and who's out, and who's subscribing to which periodicals, and so the limiting of that becomes a really important part in this demise. And then within the Church of the Nazarene, of course, you have the Seth Cook Reese wing and the other wing, and for all people who nowadays study Wesley, they owe a lot to that debate, because it was essentially that debate that revived Wesley for study in anybody's group.
Well, did other groups denounce people in print like the Church of the Nazarene did?
Oh, yeah.
Because that was the thing, you know, Seth Cook Reeves,
Yeah.
any of the Azusa people.
Well,
that we
the Church of the Nazarene was particularly gifted at that.
yes, they were. And they still are.
And so and you see the same thing happening in the UK, where it's A.M. Hills who really destroys the nationwide networks of holiness people with his rabid anti-Keswick material and whatever. He's the one who made it impossible. He broke the relationship between the Scottish holiness people and Northern Irish people, those folks over against the English ones. I mean, he was really a terrible influence.
And that Scottish group was John Milbank's grandparents.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe one last question, if there is one. Well, if not,
Thank
would you
you
join
all.
me in thanking David?